Hello and welcome to the Lutheran University's Institute of Advanced Studies. Where am I? I'm Ksenia Putin, I'm director of the IIS, and it's wonderful to host our residential fellow today, Andrey Ivanov. Welcome, Andrey. Few house rules before we begin. So we are recording the seminar for those of you online. Thank you for joining. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section. We'll be monitoring those. The seminar will be available online, but we are not publishing the Q&A, so just the actual presentation. For those of you in the room, if you have questions, there will be time. We will also be serving lunch, so there'll be time for discussion. And the presentation will be available on our YouTube channel and as a podcast in just a couple of days after the presentation. Well, as always, IIS is the place where we host the most exciting conversations, and it's just great. The conversations that we've already had with you today, bringing so many disciplines together. So I'd like to invite Alex to introduce our fellow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I have the great pleasure of meeting Ivanov at the Institute for Advanced Science at Notre Dame University in the States. Since then, the Institute of Advanced Studies there was renamed into something like Department of Developing Everything Good, as opposite to developing something bad. But the gist, I think, remains the same. So we found surprisingly many common points of interest, and well, I'm not diving into the substance of this lecture, but I think it can be summarized as follows. A specialist in IT will build you a website. If you want to build an empire, hire somebody who knows physics. Here.
Thank you very much. This is probably the best introduction I've had to any of the presentations. Yes, and a lot of the graphics in this presentation are from the website of Russian State Museum in St. Petersburg, which have been releasing a lot of their collections now online, and so a lot of the engravings from the time of Peter I and the 18th century are actually now available. So I'm very thankful that this is the case now. However, some of the materials I have acquired through my own travels in Rome and in Ukraine and in Germany, and so some of the materials are not from the Russian State Museum. So, Birth of an Empire, Feofan Prokopovych and the Metamorphosis of Petrine Russia is the title of my talk today. So, what is this all about? On October 22nd, 1721, which is the Julian calendar, not the Gregorian calendar, an extraordinary event took place in St. Petersburg. Peter I, the Tsar of Russia, had walked into the Holy Trinity Cathedral in St. Petersburg, and he walked in for a choreographed surprise. Archbishop Feofan Prokopovych, who led the liturgy, delivered a sermon declaring Peter's right to become an imperator, an emperor. And the Russian Senate proclaimed the Tsar as the emperor and the father of the fatherland. As this church ceremony unfolded, some 125 galley ships that were docked outside on the Neva River started blasting cannon fire, blank cannon fire, in unison with the gunfire of 23 infantry regiments stationed around the city. That's a lot of gunfire. The palace guards outside the cathedral shouted Roman-style acclamations, voices filling the surroundings with resounding echoes. Peter, who walked into this church as a Tsar, walked out as an emperor. On the way out, some 1,000 guests who were foreign ambassadors, clergy, nobility, followed the Tsar to the so-called Temple of Janus, where a double-headed eagle, the symbol of Janus, was located, and where everybody was drinking and partying, food, entertainment, fireworks, a lot of fireworks. Peter loved fireworks, and dancing that, quote, lasted until into the night. Masquerades accompanied festivity and continued well until October 30th, a week-long celebration. So amidst this pious and ceremonial debauchery, an empire was born. It was an unprecedented event in European history. Since the day of Caesar Augustus, the only emperors in Europe were the Roman ones. holding nominal or real authority over parts of what used to be the Western or the Eastern or both Roman empires. Peter became the continent's first non-Roman emperor. Furthermore, since the fall of the Eastern Romans in 1453, there was only one ruler who held the exclusive license to the Latin title of imperator, the Austrian Kaiser. Yes, the Kaiser of the Holy Roman Empire was the only real emperor in Europe at the time. Peter had actually shattered this title's exclusivity. Now there was a new emperor in Europe. This set the example for propagation of more empires in history. And so after Peter, the next person to do this, to imitate the title, to take the title of emperor, was Napoleon. Here you have Napoleon crowning himself as an emperor in 1804. And then later, Agustin de Iturbide in Mexico City also crowned himself as an emperor in 1822. Germany became an empire, with Wilhelm crowning himself as a Kaiser in 1871. And the British Empire was born in 1876 with the Royal Titles Act. So, but Peter was really the first one who set the example. Now, consequently, or subsequently, the term empire lost its narrow connotation. It acquired broad spectrum of multivalent as well as multidisciplinary meanings, but it was Peter, this Ukrainian Archbishop Feofan Prokopovych, and the decadent feast that set in motion the chain of events that got us to this point. So the Ukrainian Archbishop was central to this event. He was central to the birth of the empire. Prokopovych organized and prepared all of the legal justifications for declaring an empire. He choreographed the declaration process with the Holy Synod and the Holy Senate, and all the particulars of that were spelled out in the protocols of the Holy Synod, which I'm going to be quoting copiously throughout my lecture. Now, Prokopovych, by the way, is famous in the history of Eastern Slavs. He was a homo universale. He was a polymath, a universal man. He was a poet, a playwright, a linguist, a political ideologist. He was a natural philosopher. Many hats are listed here that he wore. He was the first, by the way, among the Eastern Slavic intellectuals to defend the Copernican and Galilean solar system, the first to teach physics by adopting methods of nuova scienza, new science of Torricelli, Borelli, Robert Boyle, Spinoza, von Guericke, Otto von Guericke, Descartes. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago or a week ago in my lecture of physics of Feofan Prokopovych. He adopted Protestant theology as official Orthodox doctrine. He was the author of the Russian Academy of Sciences project. The original Peter Garden Academy of Sciences project was authored by Prokopovych. He was known to have enjoyed the patronage of famous Hetman of Ukraine, Ivan Mazepa. He promoted Georg Steller for oceanic expeditions in Alaska. He was into the woolly mammoths. I mean, he was doing a lot of things. Homo universale, the universal. Just a quick run of his biography. He was born in the district of Podol in Kiev. So the main part of Kiev is on a hill. That's where they call the Volodymyr, Vladimir Quarter. And then the commercial part was here, down by the river, where he grew up in a family of wealthy merchants. He moved to Rome in 1698. This is the area where he lived in Rome, on Via del Babuino, where Collegio Greco was located. He moved to Germany in 1701, when he read the writings of Martin Luther in a secret library in Rome. He had a conversion experience where he ran away from Rome. He moved to an area that was known as Aufklärungsdreieck, the Enlightenment triangle of Halle, Jena, and Leipzig. And so he developed ties with German Enlightenment, with Jablonski, with the founder of Prussian College of Sciences, with Lawrence Mosheim, with August Hermann Frankl, with Davis, with Leibniz, with Wolff. He returned to Ukraine in 1704. He became the head of the most important educational institution in the Russian Empire at the time. He moved to St. Petersburg to lead the reforms of Peter the Great. And then in 1736, he died in St. Petersburg. So that's just kind of a run of his biography, just to tell you who he was. Now, a quick question before I start going into the substance of Prokopovich's empire building. Now, a quick question that a lot of you probably have here is, wasn't Russia already an empire? wasn't Moscow already a third Rome, right? There's this whole literature about Russia or Moscow as a third Rome. Well, the concept of third Rome was never Moscow's official ideology. It is very peripheral, really, in terms of relevance to any discussion here. Secondly, the term Tsar, Russian Tsars were Tsars, right, was not equivalent to the term emperor. The Habsburg emperors of Vienna recognized Russian rulers as Tsars, precisely because they considered the title to be inferior to the title of emperor. So in late Byzantine nomenclature and European diplomatic practice, the term Caesar or Tsar was used to delegate to mean the junior brothers of Byzantine emperors. They were Caesars. Rulers of Romania, of Serbia, Bulgaria were called Tsars. The king of Georgia, Mepe, was called Tsar in Orthodox Slavic nomenclature or the Byzantine nomenclature. King of Armenia was Tsar. In Polish and Habsburg titulary, Tsar was equivalent to the king, to the idea of the king, krul or rex in Latin. That's why in 1815, the Russian Tsar declares the Tsardom of Poland. The Russian emperor declares himself also to be the Tsar of Poland because Tsar means king. And in Eurasian titulary, Tsar was equivalent to Khan. For example, the Khan of Kazan or the Khan of Astrakhan in Russian language was known as Tsar. So it's a Eurasian term as well that indicated that kind of Ivan was the Tsar of Moscow, Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar. But then when he conquered Kazan and Astrakhan, he absorbed the title of Tsar from the Chinggisid descendants of the Golden Horde that he conquered. So the Tsar was not equivalent to the emperor, and to reach the highest level of monarchy attainable in European titular nomenclature, Tsar Peter had to become an imperator, a Kaiser, an emperor. Now, Peter's architect, Feofan Prokopovych, was responsible for establishing the edifice of the new empire. In his account of empire building, 3 acts of this drama had unfolded. The 3 acts that built the empire. The first is a conceptual link to antiquity. Even though Russia was a new empire that was not a Roman empire, it was an imitation of Roman antiquity that was built into the process. It was a wholly Russian Roman Empire where, in order to become an empire, Russia had to get recognition of Austrian emperor for the title of imperator. And it was also a sacred realm with emperors' secular and spiritual powers combined as Pontifex Maximus with overlordship in ecclesiastical affairs. So let's start with the first act. The establishment of Petersburg's empire was built on innovation and imitation. So innovation was the first feature of the ideological edifice that Feofan Prokopovych had built in establishing this empire. The protocols of the Holy Synod's 1721 deliberations in the run-up to the installation of Peter as emperor underline the novelty of this accomplishment. Russia would not be a continuation of or an inheritor to the previous Roman empires. Russia is not the Byzantine Empire transplanted in northern soil. Russia is not a restoration of a Roman Empire, but in a different soil. It's not a translatio imperium. It was innovatio imperium, the creation of empire just from nothing. And this is something that was emphasized by the protocols of Holy Synod, that the empire was made by father of the fatherland, and that's a great engraving of the father of the fatherland here, imperator, emperor. It was born from darkness into light, from non-existence into existence, and joined the Commonwealth of Political Nations. So Russia was essentially just a new entity created from nothing, ex nihilo. And Peter was the demiurge. Peter was the creator, the creator who fashioned this, who built this from nothingness. And Prokopovych emphasized that in his sermons before 1721. This is actually a running theme. It's not like Prokopovych came up with this in 1721. He's been talking about this for years in his sermons. So here are some quotations from his sermons. Peter, you created your Russia by many glorious victories. The Tsar renewed or already gave birth to Russia. And then there's a funeral oration there where he said that this is later on, he emphasized that Peter created the kind of Russia that it had become. So the Russian Empire was clearly a new entity. It had no existence before Tsar, the creator, fathered, his fatherland. Yet in the ceremony of imperial acclamation of 1721, the birth of the empire was not just an innovation, it was also an imitation of ancient Roman example. You see, in order to bake this empire from scratch, Feofan believed that one had to follow the recipe, the original recipe of Roman Empire that was unfolded in Rome in 27 BCE. You had to follow that recipe. Otherwise, the empire is not real. And the two parts of the recipe were extraordinary martial triumph was required to become a candidate for imperial title. So they're looking at Octavian, right, who becomes Caesar Augustus. How does Octavian become Caesar Augustus? What is the basis for this? The basis is martial triumph. You have to win the war. Second basis is that the Senate chooses and grants the imperial title. And so this is, by the way, wooden toy figurine from St. Petersburg's State Russian collection of Peter as Octavian or as a Roman general here. So you had to have this imitation. So on the martial triumph, this was an easy one for Prokopovych. Russia had just won the war, the Great Northern War, that lasted from 1700 to 1721. The Treaty of Nystad was signed and confirmed at the end of August and early September 1721. And so there were already celebrations of this victory. Here you have some captured Swedish ships that were paraded around the islands of St. Petersburg to show everybody, look, we won the war against Sweden. Russia gained Baltic provinces in the war. Russia gained the Gulf of Finland, and parts of Finland, like Viborg, were also conquered by Russia. The Treaty of Nystad was signed. And here you have also the statue that was put in the Summer Garden in 1722 to commemorate the Treaty of Nystad. So Peter was a glorious commander, like Octavian or Caesar, Julius Caesar, who conquered the Swedes. The Swedish line here was vanquished by the Russians. But there was also the second part, the Senate. And that's where Feofan ran into a problem. You see, Russia did technically have a Senate, which Peter established in 1711, and which was the gathering of the country's top aristocratic families, as well as the Tsar's appointees. The Senate played a very important function in running the internal affairs while Peter was away, abroad, or fighting the war. But it was not the Senate, but Feofan and the Holy Synod of the Orthodox Church that played a key role in initiating, drafting, and guiding the proclamatory process. You see, Feofan argued that because the Roman Senate habitually bestowed these titles upon the emperors for their illustrious deeds, that was the protocol's basis for the imperial proclamation. And so in ancient Rome, the Senate, which was a secular institution, proclaimed the emperors until the end of the 5th century. And then essentially, it was a secular ceremony. But Prokopovych was not a secular figure. He was an archbishop. And the Holy Synod of the Orthodox Church was, the administrative body of the Orthodox Church. It was not a secular institution. And so Prokopovych would have to recuse himself from the ceremony, which he wouldn't do because he is the ceremony, right? Prokopovych is at the center of it all, and he wouldn't want to remove it. So he had a cunning plan. He had a real, essentially a way out of this dilemma. He decided to join the offices of the Senate and the Holy Synod into one. He called it the Sacred and the Secular Senate. He used the Greek word synkrit for the Senate. And so you see here the echoes of that depicted in the ceremony. So here you have the gathering of the Senate. It has the ecclesiastical figures and the secular figures, the senators, the aristocrats. Really, you have two institutions: the secular and the sacred. And really, the sacred one plays the most important part because it's Prokopovych who's drafting this whole. but they combined the two institutions, and therefore they had overcome this problem of having a non-secular institution perform a secular ceremony that was imitating the ancient Roman example. So the second act is the Holy Russian Roman Empire. So behind the scenes of this enveloping drama of imitating the Roman precedent lurked another act that was no less important than the previous one. This was also a very important act in the birth of the empire. You see, the Byzantine state, the Eastern Roman Empire, was a continuation of Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Entity, and here you have the map of Holy Roman Entity in the 17th and 18th centuries, was an example of restoration of empire. So you have restoration of empire, you have also continuation of empire. Russia was neither of these. Holy Roman Empire was an example of restoration of empire because Charlemagne was restored the empire, and to restore the empire and be recognized as emperor, Charlemagne had to get recognition from the East. That is why Emperor Michael I had recognized Charlemagne as the emperor of Western Roman Empire, or Holy Roman Empire. And in fact, the cross recognition of the emperors was common since Diocletian. When Diocletian had kind of split the empire into 4 parts, but later it's really 2 parts, and one emperor would recognize another one. So you had 2 emperors. So in order for Peter to be a real emperor, he had to have recognition from the only existing imperator in the world at this time, the Austrian emperor. The Austrian emperor had to recognize Russia as an empire. Without it, the whole thing would just be kind of a hollow, essentially fake entity. Now, Russia and Austria were already military allies due to their common front against the Ottoman Empire. They were on very good terms. Peter was fascinated by the Holy Roman Reich. He visited Vienna in 1698 and 1699 to sign a Treaty of Karlowitz. Emperor Leopold I, who had a great fashion sense, extended this exceptional reception to Peter. The younger Tsar, by the way, viewed Leopold as his mentor and gained also good relations with Leopold's successor. So when Leopold dies, you have Joseph I, and then Charles VI, who succeeds him. And Peter had very good relations with the Austrian emperors. He was not only in diplomatic correspondence with them, he was also imitating Vienna. He was taking examples of the Austrian Reich, or the Holy Roman Reich, and incorporating into the Russian Empire. Just an example, the old Russian, the so-called Romanov Muscovite Tsar's flag, the tricolor, white, blue, and red, was replaced by black and gold standard of the Habsburg. So the Habsburg flag, which later added its black, yellow, and white, replaced the old tricolor flag. By the way, the tricolor flag would not become official again until 1896. So prior to 1896, it's the Austrian-styled flag that Peter had taken from his mentors in Vienna. But it wasn't just a flag. The Byzantine-style double-headed eagle, which is the Byzantine eagle, wings pointing down, was supplanted by the Austrian Doppeladler, with wings pointing outward, an up. So here you have, wings of the Doppeladler, the Austrian double-headed eagle. It's pointing, outward, and this is the Russian double-headed eagle. And by the way, if you go to Russian Federation today, the currency, all the flags and so on outside, they still have the Austrian eagle, not the Byzantine eagle. You see the Byzantine eagle on the flag of Albania. You see Byzantine eagle on the flag of Serbia, but not in Russia. They're still using the Austrian eagle, the Doppler. And this was part of the imitation. Apart from that, Peter had imported a whole, bureaucratic nomenclature, like the idea of having new titles, like the title of Chancellor of Russian Empire, Graf, Baron, Generalissimus. All these titles were imported from Austria and adopted in Russia. Despite good relations with Austria, Tsar Peter was unable to secure the support of Leopold for his own imperial title. In 1710, negotiations with his successor, Joseph I, did not lead to the recognition. Joseph I would not recognize him as an emperor. In 1711, Joseph I died, and you have a new emperor, Charles VI. And so Tsar Peter had decided to strengthen his ties with the new emperor, Charles VI, through marriage. What a best way to get recognition for an empire by, if not by marrying into it. Let's marry into the empire and get recognition. That was the plan. So he married his son Alexei to Charlotte Sophia of Wolfenbüttel and Brunswick, the Dutch of Brunswick, marking the first time a Romanov married into European Protestant ruling house, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire. This alliance was significant. The Dutch of Brunswick publicly recognized Peter as an emperor in the wedding ceremony. Additionally, Charlotte Sophia was the sister-in-law of Emperor Charles VI, because her sister, Elisabeth Christina of Brunswick, of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, was the wife of the new Austrian emperor. She was, by the way, the mother of Maria Theresa. And if you go to Wolfenbüttel today, there's a famous hotel where Maria Theresa was conceived. They have a big plaque outside. Come here and visit us. They conceived Maria Theresa in this hotel. So this marriage made Peter a relative of the Holy Roman Imperial family. Peter married his son into the family of Austrian Empire, literally gaining an inside track to a possible recognition. But alas, none of this worked. Despite marriage ties, there would be no official recognition for Peter from Vienna. The Emperor of Austria was holding fast to the exclusivity of the title of imperator or Kaiser. So what to do? Well, this is where Feofan Prokopovych comes in, because the archbishop had a plan, a cunning plan, a way out of this dilemma. If the Austrians would not recognize Russia as an empire, no problem. We will manufacture the recognition anyway, and then we will thank the Austrians for it. Very simple. A very, cunning plan, right? The basis for the emergence of the Russian Empire was not just an innovation or imitation, it was also recognition or concoction of recognition, called agnitio imperii in Latin. So was really a key element to this. Now, the whole scheme was based on an obscure document found in Moscow archives in 1718. It was the text of Emperor Maximilian's 1514 treaty against Poland with Grand Prince of Muscovy, not Tsar, but Grand Prince of Muscovy, Basil III, where in that document he acknowledges Maximilian III acknowledges Basil as Kaiser. Now, this is very interesting. It hasn't happened before that an Austrian emperor would recognize a Muscovite prince as a Kaiser, and it hasn't happened again. It was really an oddity, an odd document that really had no continuation, and the practice never really took off. The Russian rulers were never recognized or called Kaisers in subsequent documents. However, Peter and Feofan seized on these documents. They said, aha, you had already recognized us as emperors. And so this was the quotation from the protocol. Again, I'm quoting from the protocols. The title was already presented to His Majesty's magnificent ancestor, even though Basil III was not a Romanov, magnificent ancestor several hundred years ago by the glorious Roman Emperor Maximilian. So you do have recognition of the empire by Austria. Furthermore, the presence of foreign ambassadors at the festive ceremony, so the whole ceremony where they were drinking and blowing off fireworks, the fact that you have ambassadors from countries, different countries like France and the Duchy of Holstein, Austria, Prussia, that whole presence already meant that they recognized Russia as an empire. He called it the extending of their right hands, meaning a symbol of recognition. Of course, just being at the party doesn't mean they recognize what the cause of the party is, right? But the diplomatic protocol recognition for Russian Empire would still come in foremost. Prussia recognized Russia as an empire in 1721, Netherlands in 1722, Denmark here 1732. Now, Austria and Holy Roman Estates had a long discussion about this, and Maria Theresa finally recognized Russia as an empire, and Holy Roman Empire also recognized Russia as an empire, Poland here in 1764. So finally, an empire was born and recognized by other European powers. And now we come to the final feature of the birth of Russia's empire. In Feofan's mind, Petrine state was a sacred entity, a holy Russian empire. its sacredness was based on on one ideological pillar, the conflation, or I should say rather confluence, of sacred and secular authority. This sacralization also had roots in ancient Rome. So the idea was that Peter has to become Pontifex Maximus to become a full-scale emperor. He has to take both the spiritual and the secular authority and incorporate it into the office. Now, it all had a Roman precedent, by the way. So prior to 379 AD, an emperor of Rome also held a sacred title of Pontifex Maximus, the supreme priest of Roman religion. Every emperor in ancient Rome was the supreme priest of the pagan religion, official religion of Rome. In Christian Rome, however, Emperor Gratian abandoned the pontifical title because Saint Ambrose of Milan didn't like it. Said, "Oh, you can't be the priest of the Roman religion if we have, the actual priests of the Christian religion here." And so the term pontifex was adopted by various Western and Eastern bishops, and most notably by the Pope of Rome. Today, Pope of Rome is Pontifex Maximus. Subsequent Byzantine church-state relations, by the way, emerged in the form of symphonia, balance of powers where the church and the state were separate entities, had their own powers, but lived in some kind of symphony. And so you had the title or authority of the emperor and the title of authority of the patriarch in Eastern Rome. Now, a form of symphonia also existed in Moscow, with Tsar and the patriarch holding separate powers. Sometimes those powers were in conflict, like in 1666, with Patriarch Nikon fighting against Peter's father, Tsar Alexei. Now, one being the head of the state, the other being head of the church, you kind of had two authorities in Moscow. Peter believed that the existence of the patriarch was an impediment to modernization and reform. You can't have two arcs, right? The monarch or the autarch, the autocrat, and the patriarch. You can't have the two authorities. So what to do here? How to find a way out of this dilemma? Because patriarch is a well-respected church authority. Peter, as Tsar, can't just remove the patriarch. It has to be done through the church, an official canonical standards justified by quotations from the Bible and theology. So Peter was not a theologian. What to do? What to do? Well, this is where Feofan Prokopovych comes in, because the archbishop has a plan, a cunning plan, right? A way out of this dilemma is published in July of 1721 in an essay called Розыск Pontifexi. That's how it is kind of the short title. It actually is a very long title. Investigation into the title of Pontifex. And the main points of this essay, which becomes kind of part of the Russian legal framework. So this is the legal justification for the title of Pontifex Maximus. The argument was that a Roman imperial title of Pontifex Maximus was improperly taken away by Saint Ambrose of Milan, creating, quote, a confused nation, end of quote, where there are where there's no supreme spiritual authority anymore and two authorities now. Pope employed contrivances and deceit to capture this imperial honor, so it was a stolen authority. A monarch possesses the episcopal authority with the title of Summus Pontifex Maximus, as well as the title of Bishop of Bishops, based on the ruler's status as a lord in the dominion. Eastern Orthodox patriarchs imitated popes, became essentially, quote, ecclesiastical monocrats, end of quote, a second power, a notion which Feofan argued came from the West, and then spread to Moscow and now threatened the Roman dynasty. So patriarchs should be abolished, and Peter declared the supreme priest of Russian Orthodox religion, like a proper Roman emperor should. So Prokopovych's spiritual regulation of 1721 is the most important church reform that persisted in terms of its legal significance until 1917, until the end of the empire. And it was a charter for Russian Orthodox Church that completely reorganized the church. And so Prokopovych published this in September of 1721. So he first publishes in July the investigation about Pontifex. And the argument here is that Peter will become now the Pontifex Maximus if he's declared an emperor. And then he's declared an emperor in October. So that means, the historical investigation comes into effect in October of 1721. So you could see the whole year was very busy. The 1721 was a very busy year with church reform, where Feofan is reforming the church, and the reform of the empire happening all at the same time. Essentially, all converging into one process. Now, what did this church document argue? What was the spiritual regulation? Well, it abolished the diarchy of Tsar and Patriarch. Prokopovych argued, based on Orthodox theology, that it's papist idea to have a patriarch. He abolished the Byzantine separation between sacred authority and secular authority. The so-called imperium sacerdotum, or Tsarstvo Священство, was abolished. Patriarchate is replaced with Lutheran synodal consistorial model of administration. And Prokopovych puts himself as the head of the Holy Synod. So he's arguing this is a much better, much more orthodox, canonically, spiritually justifiable form of administration. He publishes a catechism that becomes official catechism of Orthodox Church. It's adaptation of Martin Luther's catechism, so it's official doctrine now in Russia. Monasteries and convents are proclaimed as utilitarian entities, so you don't need to have monasteries anymore, right? If you have kind of Lutheran theology. So hospitals, factories, retirement homes, are essentially what monasteries become. And here you have decline. So in 1700, you had 1,201 monasteries and convents in Russia. By 1764, it goes down to 385. Just massive closing of monasteries, of abbeys. They're all being closed down or converted into factories. The ones that are converted to hospitals, schools, factories are the ones that survive. Privacy of confession is limited, where all sins of political nature are to be reported to the secret police, and so on. So there's a lot of reforms here that I'm not going to go into all of them in detail. Now, what is the source of Prokopovich's inspiration? He didn't just make up those ideas by himself. He got it from somewhere else. So the spiritual regulation is actually based on pattern on Lutheran Kirchenordnungen or Kirchenreglementen here, like this one from Hesse. This is from 1724, but there's one called Kazimiriana from Saxony that really has a lot of parallels to spiritual regulation. So spiritual regulation comes from Lutheran church ordinances that Feofan adopted as official church ordinance of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, what about the notion of Pontifex Maximus? Where does that come from? Well, that also comes from Lutheran theology and Lutheran West. So essentially, what happened during the late Reformation in Protestant Germany, you had prominent German theologians like Stephanus, who ended the 30 Years' War with the whole idea of cuius regio, eius religio. That's a formula that ended the 30 Years' War in Germany. You had Gerhard, you had Reinking, the architect of Denmark's absolutism. They argued that Protestant Germany and Holy Roman Empire must have a Pontifex Maximus. And the Pontifex Maximus must be the emperor. So the emperor in Vienna must be declared by the Lutheran Church as the supreme priest of the Lutheran Church in Vienna. Now they ran into a problem because the emperor in Vienna was a Roman Catholic, and he would never accept a title of Pontifex Maximus. So if the Lutherans in Germany wanted to give the emperor in Austria the title of Pontifex Maximus, he would never accept such a title. So instead of giving this title to an emperor, they decided to designate episcopal lordships over church affairs to local Protestant rulers, like the King of Denmark. The King of Denmark becomes the summus episcopus. He becomes the supreme bishop of Denmark. And the elector of Brandenburg would become the supreme lord over ecclesiastical affairs. But you see, Prokopovych and Peter did not have those qualms. Peter could be declared an emperor and Pontifex Maximus. He's not a Roman Catholic. He can take both titles and be a full restored emperor with both powers, just like the Roman emperors were prior to 479. Now, Prokopovich's idea of secular and sacred, by the way, also had parallels in Thomas Hobbes. So I'm ending here now with kind of not a very bright spot. Thomas Hobbes is not known as for his sort of most positive writings, but Thomas Hobbes argued that you cannot have two authorities because the simple people would be seeing double. This fear of seeing double really gripped Leviathan. That you can't have somebody who's in charge, the Pope who's in charge of the church and the king who's in charge of England. You can't have them at the same time. You must have both authorities merged into one. And so here you have the spiritual regulation, and here you have Hobbes' Leviathan, first chapter, and so here, first tome. And so the parallels are very clear, that the idea of seeing doubles, that the simple people will see that, there will be two powers or two rulers, and this would lead to revolts and civil war, like the Civil War in England. This is all very, clearly comes from Hobbes. But there are actually a lot more parallels in Prokopovych and Hobbes that go beyond that. I'll just go through them very quickly and not cover all of them, but we can talk more about this in Q&A. So there was a kind of politics to the physics, or the physics to the politics of Prokopovych and Hobbes, because they both opposed the idea of emptiness, of void, right? They said there is no void, they were plenus. They said everything is filled with a plenum. And they argued, Hobbes argued this, and Prokopovych argued this, that if you have vacuum, right? And this is, my last week lecture when I talked about the physics of Prokopovych, how he argued that there cannot be void or cannot be vacuum. But they also argued that, the society abhors political vacuum. If you have political vacuum, well, then you have wars, and you have war of all against all. And this should be prevented, and you must have plenum. And so the emperor or the king here, this is Charles II, right? That's his portrait, kind of fills everything with the plenum. Prokopovych argued that all world was material and all was matter. This is something that Hobbes also argued. So even angels are made out of matter. There's no such thing as ghosts. They're material beings. He didn't say the ghosts didn't exist. He just said everything is material in this world. Everything that was created by God, except for God, of course, are material. And even if we don't see angels, it doesn't mean that they're non-material. So this means that if everything is material, you cannot have two authorities, a material authority and an immaterial authority. No, if everything in this world is matter, then everything in this world must be to the subject of emperor's authority. And so Prokopovych argued this very clearly. Everything is subject to the authority of secular ruler because everything is material. They both argued against miracles. Actually, there are some quotes here that they said that in the monarchy, you won't have miracles because the emperor is the miracle. You only have miracles in countries or states with weak monarchy. If you have countries with very, very weak monarchies, then you have all these priests who manufacture miracles, but the real miracle is Peter I, the emperor of all Russia. So I'm going to end here. And, in this cauldron of this Hobbesian world, this cauldron of sacred and secular confluence in the drama of imitation and innovation, in the concoction of recognition, an empire was born. So I'm going to yield the floor for any questions, comments, rejoinders, or rebuttals. Thank you very much.